Welcome back. With some high-profile strikes almost happening and others on the horizon, what is the balance between workers' rights and that of business to carry on? Here's what you need to know. The right of workers to unionize is protected in Canada under freedom of association in the Charter of Rights. Organizing a union is also protected by law. Still, the number of Canadians in unions continues to fall. 29% of employees were part of a union in 2022, down from 38% in 1981. The bulk of that decline came before 1997, but another 30% drop occurred between 97 and 2022. The drop happened almost entirely in the private sector, where union rates fell from 29% in 1981 to 15% in 2022. For the public sector, including healthcare, education, and government workers, union rates were pretty flat over that same period, dropping slightly from 62.5% to 61.6% 40 years later. The right to strike is also a constitutionally protected one and has been since a 2015 Supreme Court ruling reversed decades of previous law on the subject, arguing that workers' right to strike is an essential part of the bargaining process. But workers who are considered essential may not be allowed to strike in Canada. That includes services like police and paramedics. Workers in federally regulated industries may see cases sent to the Canadian Industrial Relations Board, as happened recently with rail workers threatening to strike. This quasi-judicial body has the power to interpret and enforce federal law and, in the most recent case, uphold a decision to force the two sides, workers and the companies, to negotiate through binding arbitration. That move, which came at the request of the Labour Minister, will be challenged in court by the Teamsters Union at the rail companies. But meantime, the trains are back on the tracks. How the court rules on that may come down to how essential it determines the services provided by the rail companies is. But in general, workers in the public sector have more bargaining power than those in the private sector, who are more likely to work without a union negotiating on their behalf. But do recent events tilt the power unfairly in favor of employers? And how important is the right to strike anyway? Jim Stanford is director of the Centre for Future Work. Jim, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Amanda. Glad to be here.
So this is a perennial question, which is, why do we allow strikes that are so disruptive, bad for the economy, when there is this perfectly useful binding arbitration process available to sort out these disputes?
Well, a couple of things, Amanda. First of all, that was a lockout at the railways, not a strike. The two companies locked the workers out. I think in order to try and precipitate some kind of back-to-work ruling from the Labour Minister. So employers can go on strike, if you like. That's what a lockout is. The idea of a work stoppage, either side can kind of, pull the trigger when it comes to that, is to enforce a cost of disagreement on the other side and get the other side to take you seriously. If you don't have the ability to impose some kind of cost of disagreement, then you just kind of sit there and whine. You put forward your demands, but you can't really do anything about it. And employers in general would prefer to have that threat taken off the table. So if, in fact, this decision, this approach with the railways stands and the courts ratify it, then I think in other federally regulated industries, whether it's communications or transportation, airlines, the ports, I think we'll see a real shift in bargaining power where the employers in those industries just stop taking the union too seriously.
I'll go back to, though, Jim, the notion of binding arbitration. Yes. Presumably, there's a fair outcome in that. There's a third-party, independent, unbiased view helping the two sides reach an outcome. They both have to live with it. Why is that not a good mechanism to sort out labor disputes so that we don't see parts of the economy grind to a halt when they can't come to agreement?
Well, arbitration has its uses in certain circumstances. Obviously, in things that are genuinely essential services, then it's one way to try and reach a settlement to an impasse. Now, arbitration is not always fair, though, particularly when you're trying to change something that's structural in the workplace. So arbitrators tend to look at past patterns and kind of replicate those patterns and precedents in their decisions. So if you're looking for changes in things, think about some of the things that workers won over the years, like a 40-hour work week or rights to health and safety protection, or things that were new. Very, very hard to get those in an arbitration setting. So that's one of the drawbacks. The other point about essential services, I mean, here we are thinking about railways as an essential service. Remember, these are privately owned companies, highly profitable privately owned companies. They made $4 billion profit between the two of them the first half of this year, and they'll make that much again in the second half of the year. So it's a bit of having your cake and eating it too, to say, well, we're going to run this like a private business and try and make as much money as we can out of it. But if the workers try to get a share of it, well, now we're an essential public service and you're not allowed to act. That's I think, a bit hypocritical.
Jim, so good to have you. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Amanda.
Jim Stanford is director of the Center for Future Work. Well, in increasingly complex supply chains, transportation might be easy to be seen as essential, but is there also a case to be made for all negotiations to go to arbitration? Where are the rights of businesses and consumers in this? Perrin Beatty is president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Perrin, so good to see you.
So glad to be here.
So I guess one of the questions about what is essential, and you know, Jim Stanford has said rail transportation companies are not. They're highly profitable private businesses. Could we consider something that moves goods around this country in the way that they do as an essential part of our economy?
Well, the term essential service is essentially a legalistic term, but the question we have to ask ourselves is, how important is this to the Canadian economy and to ordinary Canadians? And the answer is, in a number of these areas, such as the railroads, the airlines, the ports, other elements of infrastructure, they're critical to the proper functioning of our economy.
So we do have some well-entrenched rights for workers, especially unionized workers, Perrin, to strike. The Supreme Court has upheld that right. Are business rights protected enough? Is the balance of power too much in favor of the unionized worker, at least, if not all private sector workers?
What the government has done is they've tilted the balance. We spent decades trying to build in Canada a balance between management and labor, which gave workers the right to strike and gave management the ability to lock out, and encouraged both of them to come to agreements at the bargaining table. What we've seen in recent years is the politicians going out of their way, and particularly in this past year, the politicians going out of their way to move from the head of the table, representing the public interest, to sitting on one side beside the unions. So, for example, we had legislation banning replacement workers during strikes, and the government held press conferences with union leaders who said this was the most important change in labor law in years. Well, they were quite right. What we were doing is disrupting a very carefully designed balance, and it's the public that loses out as a result.
Interesting, because this most recent move that did see that lockout end and binding arbitration be forced upon the rail companies and their employees, has been seen as pro-company. Do you not see it that way, that this is pro-business? I
see it as pro-public. What the government finally said to both business and labor is, we're going to have an independent arbitrator, somebody who isn't beholden either to business, either to management or to labor, to come in and have a settlement there that's in the public interest, that's fair to both parties and is in the public interest at the end of the day. It would have been far better that an agreement had been reached at the bargaining table. When that couldn't be done, the public interest had to be respected here. And the same applies if we look at Air Canada, where there's the potential for a strike of Air Canada pilots. The critical concern here is, how do we protect the public interest and do so in a way that's fair to both parties?
We've only got a few seconds, Perrin, but why not have binding arbitration be the law of the land rather than allow strikes?
Well, ideally, you want something where both parties are happy and where they feel they've reached a good agreement that serves the interests of both sides, and they're glad to see it in place. When that breaks down, the government doesn't have any choice but to act if the public is going to be very severely damaged as a result of a labor disruption. And that's where we were with CN. That's potentially where we're going to be with Air Canada as well.
Perrin, so good to have your thoughts always. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Still ahead, Canada is hitting China with tariffs, but will China hit back? That's coming up. But first, IKEA is looking to turn a problem into an opportunity. It seems there is a healthy aftermarket for Billy bookcases and other previously purchased IKEA furniture, and the Swedish firm wants in. It's testing IKEA pre-owned in Madrid and Oslo, connecting buyers and sellers and throwing in the option to receive IKEA gift cards instead of cash. All we can say is that if IKEA calls it the marketplace already assembled, the stuff will sell itself. We're back after this.